Well, hey everyone, Andy Serwich here with Altero Software, and coming here today to talk to you about Sunburst, the big SolarWinds hack that's been talked about in the news lately. I don't think anybody's been able to look at a news page without seeing some mention of this breach. So, what I wanted to do is we've actually brought on a security expert, Fabio Vigiani from TrueSec, to talk to us a little bit about this breach and what it means for the industry. How's it going, Fabio?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Fabio. I am the technical lead for TrueSec security team. We do a lot of incident response, forensic investigations. We do also all sorts of penetration testing, red teaming. So different aspects of security. We do secure development, and we provide the threat detection and monitoring services for our customers as well. I'm personally mostly involved nowadays in incident response missions and threat intelligence, but I do have a background in the red teaming and the offensive security side of things too.
Okay, so it sounds like they keep you pretty busy with with just about all facets of security over there.
Yeah, there is a lot going on, and it's a very fast-changing world. So we try to stay ahead of the game.
Well, that's half the battle just in and of itself, right? So, well, hey, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk to us about this today. Our audience primarily consists of IT professionals, working in IT departments around the world, as well as managed services, professionals, helping servicing their customer base on a day-to-day basis. And what we wanted to do is just kind of have you on and talk a little bit about this breach. And, I guess what I'll start with as a first question is, if you can just give us a quick rundown of what the breach is, and then maybe talk about who is affected to start.
Right. So the main component of the attack is the supply chain attack. So SolarWinds was breached, and apparently their build system and solution was breached, and malware was introduced as part of the source code of one of their products, which is called Orion. And then it was then digitally signed as part of the build process from SolarWinds, and it was then distributed to what's estimated by SolarWinds to be about 18,000 customers that have this versions of software that contains a backdoor. And what the backdoor does is that it contacts a certain domain that is part of the threat actor infrastructure, and it basically keeps calling and asks for instructions. And it does it in a way that it lets the threat actor know some internal information about the company that is breached, like the internal domain name that the system is joined to, for example. So then the next stage will depend on what the threat actors wants to do with that information. Now we're talking about this, 18,000 potentially affected customers with this software. So obviously they need to have some kind of way of selecting the ones where they want to move to the next stage, right? So that's basically, the backdoor itself is fairly sophisticated. The actual code blends very well with the original code inside the Orion software. So they've actually done a lot of work to hide in plain sight. So, a developer looking at the code, the goal for them was so that a developer looking at the code would not recognize that there is additional code that was not supposed to be there. Right. So they use names and function names and variables that are named according to other parts of the code that are legit. So that part in itself is pretty interesting. And the whole communication protocol is also quite advanced. And it's done in a way that it probably wouldn't trigger any type of detection, both on the host that are affected, but also network-wise, if you have some kind of network detection solution. So that's basically the main part of it. Then we also know that after the initial wave of deploying the backdoor through the Orion software, they have moved to stage 2 for a number of affected organizations. That number is hard to tell, really.
Right.
What we have, we took some historical data, which is about 1,500 DNS requests spread over several months. We see activities as early as March and April 2020. We see a peak of activity in the summer, around July. But based on that, we have a fairly big percentage, actually, of breach organizations where we see indications of possibly moving to a stage 2. But it's also hard to tell exactly what stage 2 means for the threat actor. They probably had multiple stages, right? So you need to do some additional reconnaissance inside the breached organizations to see, is this an interesting target or not? So we have this original 18,000. Those are affected in a way that they had a backdoor. Then you have a subset of those, which is where the threat actor did something additional. And then you have, from there, you basically have, you're either one of the targets, right? So then we know that they've definitely done something additional there. And we know that when that happens, they use a separate infrastructure, separate techniques. So it's not necessarily easy to link it to the actual Orion infection.
Right. Okay.
A provider, a service provider, or a software provider of one of the targets, then you might be used to access those targets. So that's another layer, right? And we actually know that happened. That's what happened to CrowdStrike. They reported that the vendor that sells them Microsoft Office licenses, they were breached and they were used to try and access CrowdStrike Microsoft services. Now, they didn't use Office 365, but that was the goal of the attack in that case. So we can assume that it was probably done for other targets as well.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. So basically, the basis of the attack is they use SolarWinds basically as a mechanism, as a backdoor into several different organizations, 18,000, I think you said, and then sent information back to the threat actor. And based on that information, maybe they took additional activities based on that information. Maybe, I read your article out on the TrueSec blog, which, I'll make sure we link below this video, which fantastic blog, by the way. I remember one of the domains that you specifically called out was a Cisco domain, right? So based on that domain information, maybe they want to take additional actions, and that's when you said that's when they go into phase 2, when maybe they've done something additional other than just getting the back door in place, right?
Exactly. So, what they do next, we don't know. But you could imagine that, first they need to verify that they're actually in the right place, because the only thing they get is the internal name of the domain that the system is joined to, which is also what we have. So when we actually when we're pointing to a possible organization, we only base that information on the internal name that we could decode from the cache request that we got a hold of. And this is public information, by the way, so that's why we can talk about it. And that's the same data that the threat actor started with, right? They have this internal name, and they need to verify that they're actually in the right place and what they can do from there. And these are long-lasting operations. We're not talking about the common ransomware gang that goes in and does noisy job. And,
right.
We're talking about a nation-state actor that has easily months or years that can invest in this type of attack. So they're probably very stealthy when they move to stage 2.
Gotcha. Well, that kind of segues into my second question, and that is, how has this issue really affected your rank and file IT pro and service providers in the industry? So it sounds like Orion is the primary item that's been breached, right? If you're using Orion, all bets are off, I'm guessing, right? You could have been involved in the breach in some way, shape, or form. If you're using maybe a different code set over at SolarWinds, like maybe SolarWinds MSP, I don't think there's been any information released to date that states those code bases were compromised. Are you aware of anything there?
No.
Okay.
It should be Orion. And there are certain versions that were distributed in a certain time window. Those are the ones that are affected.
Gotcha.
Microsoft has actually pretty good guidelines and recommendations on their sites.
Good. So it's only a couple of certain versions that were affected of Orion then. So I'm sure they've since patched the issue, I'm guessing.
Yeah, this 18,000, that's a number that is estimated by SolarWinds based on their customer base using this product. Then, the malicious version must have had downloaded, during the time that it was hosted on the download side from SolarWinds. And that's been several months, I think, I think it was around from March 2020 until December when it was discovered. It was actually still online a couple of days after it was reported, so we were actually able to go and download it when it was already all over the papers. The version was still up and running.
Oh wow. Wow. So
it's been there for several months. So we don't know how many of those 18,000 potential customers are affected, but we can expect a large number.
right, and as with any breach, that number is likely to change as we move forward and find out more, right? At least from my seat in the industry, that seems like what always happens. I'm not, I don't sit in a security chair like you do, but I do keep track of the news and stuff, and usually it seems like the numbers always change, right?
Yeah, I mean, doing a proper incident response is usually not an easy task,
right?
Especially when you don't have a dedicated team for that. So what happens here is that you have this huge number of organizations affected by this breach that need to somewhat do some kind of investigation to see, first of all, if they are affected, and if they are, is there any sign of anything else, rather, or in addition to just having the backdoor.
Right.
And that's, I think, a challenge that most companies have now and that I've had for the past couple of weeks. Like, how can we do this? Do we even have the resources and the capacity and the capabilities to run such an investigation? And well, I mean, maybe you're not affected at all, and if you are, I mean, obviously ensure you don't have the backdoor version anymore. But how do you ensure that nothing else really happened?
Right.
That's already hard in the typical case, like
right.
in a cyber crime type of breach. In this case, it's much harder even because, first of all, it spans across several months.
Yep.
We all know that keeping enough logs lasting several months, that usually not the case, at least not to the level that you should have for doing a proper forensic investigation.
Yep.
So that makes it hard even for a professional incident response team. So you always kind of left with the doubt, like, have we really found what was to be found, if there was anything? So I think all in all, this kind of brings more to light the idea of assumed breach, which is what we've been talking about for years.
Yep.
You should assume breach. Well, this is the typical situation where you really have to, right? Because you might very well have been breached by even a second stage of the attack, and you don't know about it. So I mean, it's not it's not necessarily an easy thing to solve. But it's usually a combination of ensuring that you do the investigation that you can do, and there is good documentation. There are really good guidelines from Microsoft, both from the Orion side of things, but also from the Microsoft services, which is which has been the focus, at least in some of the attacks, or of the second stage of the attack, in this case. So some of the companies that have been really targeted after the Orion backdoor, they've been, I mean, their Office 365 and Microsoft services were accessed then. So emails and other services.
Right.
So those are the two things to start looking at. And yeah, but I mean, you need to make sure you have those things in play. At least you do the investigation that you can do.
Right.
And then have some kind of monitoring and detection of what's going on in your environment. Even if it's only from now, at least you have it, and you can maybe go back to your customers and say, hey, we have at least now the situation under control, and if there is something happening, we should be able to see it. Yeah,
it makes sense. So, I think about how a breach like this could change IT as an industry, right? And you made a good point, about the threat actor accessing, data contained in Office 365. I mean, there's so many organizations worldwide that have moved to cloud platforms and are utilizing those platforms to the fullest extent, right? Using SharePoint, using OneDrive, using Exchange Online, all those different services. And you look at a breach like this, and I can't help but wonder, like, how do you see it changing the industry moving forward? The other thing I look at is from a government perspective. You look at how many U.S. government agencies were affected by this, and the possible data that was exfiltrated from those organizations. Do you see any I mean, there's always the possibility, right? But I mean, this one feels different. Do you see potentially some new regulatory changes coming down the line as a response to this, or any gut feelings on that you can think of?
Well, I think, I mean, as in strict regulations, I'm not sure about that, but probably more in terms of guidelines and recommendations for how, what type of requirements you should have on your vendors and suppliers. That's also kind of hard, like, to really measure, though. I mean, we all know compliance doesn't really mean security, right? So you can set those requirements, which is good. It's good because you force your suppliers to actually do their homework to some extent, right?
Yep.
Which is what we've been talking about for years. So that's maybe a push in that direction, and it's not a bad thing. That you have to start providing the type of proof and information to your customers. That's good.
Yep.
There is a risk, though, in my opinion, that there can be a bit too much focus on supply chain attacks, which are obviously a threat, and this is proof of that. But there are a lot of other threats that are more common or more commonly misused, or vulnerabilities that are more commonly misused by threat actors to do the big bulk of damage that we can actually see today. I mean, you have advanced attacks. They do happen. They're not going to stop. They've been happening for a long time.
Right.
This is just very public, but it's not really. I mean, if you take any security professional, they're not surprised that this happened.
Right.
It's just the extent is huge, so it became a huge story. But it's not, it's not, it's nothing new. This happens.
Right.
It is.
It's just a Tuesday for you guys, right?
Maybe not to this extent. But
right.
All the time.
Right.
Most of them we don't know about it. But yeah, like I was saying, there might be too much focus on this particular attack or these types of attacks, which is supply chain attacks. There is a lot of other things that you should probably start working on before you take care of, securing the whole supply chain, which is a very complex, thing to do.
Right.
Live in very, very complex systems where there are a lot of dependencies and multiple layers of dependencies, internally and externally. You can do a lot and come a long way, but it's going to be very hard to protect against this type of threat actor. We talk about sophistication level of the threat actor. This will be at the top of the scale. So it's going to be very hard to protect from there. Right. But it doesn't matter if you have like a really secure, development and build system and solution, everything fancy and secure in the best way. If then you can access your systems from the internet with FTP and password company name 123, you need to fix that first, right? So I mean, it's we've been talking about is like we always talk about this. You need to identify the low-hanging fruit, start working on those first, and then move up the ladder. Then you start by protecting against the lower level of sophistication level of threat actors, which are the big bulk, really.
Right.
And start moving up the ladder until you reach a point that you're satisfied to be protected against. Like, do you want to protect against, a lone hacker or organized crime or nation state or all the levels in between? You need to decide where you want to be and work that way.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. Like you said, don't get so hung up on the supply chain issue, right? But more focus on. You got to secure the foundations of your house first, right? I mean, if you've got FTP open to the internet, that's a bigger issue than having to worry about, maybe one of your software vendors getting hit by a supply chain attack. Yeah, that's totally that kind of puts things in perspective there.
Yeah, and I mean, it's still a very valid, obviously, a very real threat, and it doesn't need to be as sophisticated as the SolarWinds hack. I mean, you have probably a lot of dependencies with different vendors, and many of them we probably don't even know we have.
Right.
Because it's really hard to really get the full picture of what's dependent on each other, internally and externally. So start to identifying those types of dependencies should be the ground that you can then build security on. So, I mean, you have a lot of components that maybe you don't even need or are dependent on others, then you can maybe get rid of. Or you maybe realize that you have critical systems that are actually dependent on software that is handled by systems that are not at all considered critical. And then you have a big dependency there. Like, what if that system gets hacked first? If you identify those things first, then you decide where to put your focus.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, it kind of leads into the last question I want to talk about, and I want to put a bit of more of a service provider spin on this one. And you look at any MSP related community on the internet right now, like I'll use the MSP subreddit on Reddit as an example, and you see so many posts about this particular breach, and there's so much fire and brimstone type of talk going on in those communities right now. And if I put myself in their shoes, I spent a lot of time in my career in the MSP space, and if I still had my MSP hat on and I was using SolarWinds, I'd be panicking right now, right? I'd be, okay, where do I go from here? What do I need to do to make sure that, I'm safe, my customers are safe? And I mean, how do you even communicate that to your customer base as well? Because I mean, if I put myself in the MSP owner's shoes and I'm talking to my customers and I say, oh, hey, that big hack, that breach you've heard about in the news, yeah, we totally use that software. So I mean, what would be your advice to service providers that are looking at this right now?
Yeah, so obviously there is a lot of focus on this. So there are questions asked and there are things to answer, obviously, like you're saying. And I'll try to answer that in a second. But before I do that, I just want to highlight, I mean, this is not a new thing, yep, right? Especially the MSP part of things. This lesson should have been learned at least in, 2016 when we had the CloudHopper attack.
Right.
From there already, you should have started asking all these questions. And hopefully by now you should be able to answer many of them. But we all know that it's easy to say, but then in practice it's not necessarily that easy. So to answer your question, there are obviously things that should be done right away. So first of all, identify whether you're affected and follow the recommended guidelines to do an investigation of at least checking for certain indicators of compromise, domain names, go through your logs, see if you can see anything. If you don't, again, it might mean that you don't have enough logs, enough things to look at, or hopefully you do. But then you can say that at least you've done the investigation, you follow the guidelines for what's what you're supposed to be doing,
right?
And you can get external help if needed. Then, like I said before, you kind of need to do your homework in terms of like getting a solid understanding for your environment and your dependencies. That's more of internal work. It's not something you necessarily need to communicate directly.
Right.
But if you do that, it will enable you to actually go to your customer and say, we feel that we have the situation under control. And like I said before, if you have detection and monitoring capabilities, then you can say that we don't see anything, but we have the capabilities to see when things happen. So if we do see, a connection to a known bad IP, because maybe we have that type of notification from, I don't know, Microsoft, Fire, whatever, about their attack, then we can check our systems too. But you need to be able to look for those things. Then you can say, we looked and we haven't found it, but you need to look at it.
Right. Well, it's good advice. I mean, a lot of the recommendations stay the same. I think the only potential difference maybe is that you're potentially doing it at scale. So if you have to patch, instead of having to patch one organization, maybe you're patching 50 or whatever your customer base is, right? So, but yeah, it sounds like a lot of those best practices stay the same.
Yeah. So I mean, if you're a software vendor, it's a little bit different too, right? So in the SolarWinds case, then you need to work on the actual development and build life cycles. Like I said before, there are a lot of moving parts there. It's not an easy thing to do. It's also not really my area of expertise. I have colleagues that work with that all the time, and they have really good points in terms of doing a threat modeling of all your process and see where you can actually potentially affect. There are ways to secure that, but it's not going to work the same way that you used to work with it, probably. So There's going to be some changes. And like I said before, you need to put things in perspective and identify what are your low-hanging fruits first. Then I think in most cases you will either host customer systems or you will have access to customer systems. So then again, identifying all of those dependencies and see how things are set up. Like, how do you access your customers? Do you do everything from the same jump servers? How does permissions look like to log on to those servers?
Right.
Who has access to push software to that servers, and where are those people logging on from, and who manage the workstations they log on from, and so on.
Yep.
I mean, again, CloudHopper was a clear case. We did investigation. We did find, keyloggers on the jump servers that large MSPs used to jump to all their customers.
Right. Right.
So, so again, there is a lot you can do. It's a matter of finding the right priority, identify what really brings value. Like I said, if you think about sophistication level of a threat actor, who do you want to defend against? And it's usually some time that it takes between a threat actor gets into the environment and until they reach their goal.
Yep.
So by implementing all this measure, by hardening your systems, eliminating dependencies, restricting permissions, and so on, what you're doing is that you are extending the time that it takes from when they breach, because you should assume breach, until they succeed or until they move to their target, which might be one of your customers. But the more you increase that time and the more you have the chances to see what's happening, to see that you actually have a breach and things are happening in your environment, provided that you have the capabilities to detect that.
Right.
So combination of working on that hardening, increasing that time, and make sure you have detection capabilities working on 24/7 so you can detect in real time. Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, that's fantastic advice. And, again, like I said it when we got on the call here, but I really appreciate you taking the time today to come and share your knowledge with our viewers. One thing I want to wrap up with really quick is, if somebody watching this video wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, well, on the TrueSec side, you can find information about me, Fabio Viggiani. Otherwise, you can get me on Twitter at Fabio_Viggiani.
Sounds good. I'll be sure to link that below this video as well. That way you have easy access to that. And again, Fabio, really appreciate taking the time today to come and talk to us. And it's been great. And sorry, I keep talking over you.
That's fine. I just said thanks for having me.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have to have you again here sometime. This has been a fantastic conversation. But everyone watching, appreciate you watching the video today, and we'll let you get back to your day. And other than that, have a great day, and hope to see you again for another Altero video here sometime in the future.